whether you like it or not. Alone is something you'll be quite a lot.
This story isn't mine, but one that was told to me by my nanny, more like a grandma figure to me when I was younger. This story has stuck with me vividly all these years. In this story, I'll call my nanny Sarah. Sarah was a teenager in the 60s, and she was with her mum visiting family out in the country. They were staying in a house with Sarah's uncle, aunt, and 2 cousins. One summer night, Sarah and her cousins, both girls also teenagers, were out late drinking beer. They started their drive home around 1 a.m. They were about 30 minutes away from their house, going straight along a rural road that went on for miles. It was pitch black with no streetlights, and they were about 10 minutes away from the house when they noticed a truck was behind them. At first, they thought nothing of it, but the truck continued to get closer and closer until it was right on their tail. Sarah and her cousins began freaking out and driving faster, but so did the truck. Then, it turned on its brights. Sarah told me they just kept driving faster and faster, but the truck kept following them. It was so bright, they could barely see. Finally, they got to the house and turned onto the dirt road it was on. A bad decision they were about to realize. The dirt road only had one access point to the road they were coming from. As soon as Sarah and her cousins pulled in towards the house, the truck pulled into the driveway and swerved sideways, blocking the only exit. 3 men slowly got out of the car, holding large objects that Sarah couldn't quite make out. At this point, it was nearly 1:30 a.m. when Sarah heard her mother screaming from the house, "Sarah, run!" Sarah and her cousins bolted into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it behind them. Only moments later, the doorknob began rattling, and the men began banging on the door. The men began walking around the house, trying to get into every window they could find. After about 30 harrowing minutes, they seemingly gave up. I guess they didn't have a phone at the time, so they had no way to call for help. The biggest question Sarah had was, why was her mum awake in the middle of the night? And how was she outside at just the right time? She had no way of knowing that Sarah was in trouble. Sarah's mum said she had a dream that something bad was going to happen to Sarah, and she woke up in a sweat with a terrible feeling. She went outside to see if their car was back, to see if they made it home safe, and that's when they pulled into the driveway. This happened about 30 years ago to my grandfather, and given he's older than dirt, I'm typing it up for him as he tells it. This was around January of 1988. I went to work for a company called MUSC, Maritime and Underwater Security Consultants. US based, but most of her operations were over there in Indonesia. Basically, big freight companies wanted protection from local pirates. However, many simply weren't willing to pay the price and would choose to rely on the Navy. Which, son, let me tell you, after almost 16 years in the Navy, I learned a big thing. It's slow as hell. From South Korea to the Philippines, into Indonesia, and then onto Australia before making the journey home, the boys and I, 16 security personnel total, were stuck with a crew of about 50 Norwegians, and really, the captain was the only one who knew a lick of decent English. Anyway, we were passing through Makassar Strait at around 01:30. Dark as hell. The ocean was quiet. We'd advised the captain that sailing through this particular stretch of sea at night would increase our fee a shit ton. It was honestly the dumbest idea to ever have come out of that sucker's mouth. There had been 3 attacks on different merchant vessels the night prior. Nonetheless, in this man's infinite wisdom and wallet, he directed the crew to steam through. So us, educated Yankee folk, went to the upper decks and got ready for what was destined to be one hell of a night. Assault rifles, Kevlar, light machine guns, fire hoses, the whole kaboom. Full 360 security too. Most of the boys I was with were prior Navy, with some, even if limited, combat experience. So we were pretty confident that we were able to handle some pirates armed with AKs. For the first hour and a half, everything was quiet. But that's the Q word that always lands people in trouble. Come up on the second hour, we received a distress call from another vessel about a mile away from us. The contract with this particular employer included terms that we had to render aid to other vessels in need for a fee adjustment. The captain directed our CO to send a few boys via RHIB over to this other vessel. So the course was adjusted. We got within 200 yards of this other ship, and the RHIB was being loaded up. Guess who got to go over? Myself and 5 others. To beat it all, this other freighter wasn't responding to hails or light signals. We were going in dark. We load up and cross the eerily dark and choppy ass sea. Shoot boarding grapples and climb up. Now son, you know how I feel about the next part, so I'm going to save some of the details. We cleared the bridge. Nobody was there. We cleared the crew quarters. Nobody was there. We cleared the lower decks. Nobody was there. Eventually, when we got to the engine compartments, we saw death. About 10 or 15 men had been cut up, shot, absolutely torn to bits, as if they'd been thrown into a blender. Limbs and feces laid about the room. It was absolutely disgusting. Turns out, we'd stumbled across a kidnapping gone wrong. Some of the crew had fought back, so the local pirates dealt with them, took the remainder of the crew for ransom. Funny enough, our CO told us later that MUSC was the K&R company that retrieved them. So Grandpa has dementia, but this is one story that he's told consistently for the better part of his life. So, Mr. Pirate Folk, assuming you're all dead now, or at least I hope you are, let's not meet. In 2008, I was driving from New Orleans, Louisiana, to Eugene, Oregon. It was just me, 22 female, and my year-old pit bull in a 14-foot U-Haul truck with everything I owned crammed into the back, a fancy flip phone, and my printout of MapQuest directions. I think the first smartphones actually came out around that time, but I didn't have one. Cell phone service was also much spottier, and there were long stretches through the desert where I had zero service for hundreds of miles. I was driving a lonely stretch of highway through central Texas when I realized I hadn't seen a town or exit for a very long time, and my giant U-Haul was really low on gas. Just when I'm starting to freak out and seriously run out of gas, I see a small town coming up. I pull into this town and it is tiny. I was so worried about other things that I never did pay attention to the name of the town, but there were only about 6 streets in the whole place. I go gas up and am ready to get back on the road, except I cannot for the life of me find my way back to the highway. I circle the town about 4 times and start getting so frustrated because this is such a tiny town. How can I not find my way out? I can literally see the highway, but I can't get to it. I returned to the gas station to ask for directions. Now, when I got gas, I paid at the pump and never went in. When I enter for directions, there's a skinny, nondescript guy who has black hair hanging down in front of his eyes that looks like it could use a good wash. He's not particularly creepy, but a little rude. He never really met my eyes. He was looking down at a magazine. He gives me directions that don't sound right at all. He's telling me to take a road that will get me to the highway in about 17 miles. For a moment, I'm dumbfounded. Then I point out that I didn't drive that far to get from the highway into town. Why so far to get back to the highway? I can literally see it from the town. He is so casual, almost like I'm just an annoyance, and can follow his directions or not. Why should he care? He gives me some explanation about the road curving around that doesn't really make sense. He still doesn't look at me. Just whatever. I gave you your directions, and waved his hand in the direction of the door. When I got into the parking lot, my whole body started trembling violently, and my heart started racing, seemingly for no reason. I get into the truck, and as soon as I put the key into the ignition, I burst into tears. I had the most terrible feeling that, no matter how nonchalant he acted, this man had bad intentions. I didn't know what, but I knew right then and there that there was no way I was going to follow his directions. Yet, this was the only store in this little town, and short of knocking on doors, there was no one else to ask for directions. I decided I didn't give a shit if this town seemed like something dropped out of the Twilight Zone. I was going to drive around until I found my own way out, even if it took all damn night. Then, a big red beat of a pickup truck, as much rust as metal, pulls up and disgorged the quintessential Texan man. Huge, husky, and in flannel and work boots. Without even thinking about it, I jumped out of the truck and approached him quickly yet warily. Looking into his eyes, I saw a kind human being, or at least I was hoping I did. I asked him if he could please give me directions to the highway. I told him I knew it was silly, but I just couldn't seem to find my way back. He looked concerned, as I was visibly upset, so he made me laugh and very cheerfully gave me directions for a hairpin curve turnoff right at the end of a small concrete tunnel I had passed several times. He said it often confused travelers because it was so hard to see. They needed to put up signs, etc. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I asked him how many miles it was back to the highway. He laughed and gave me a funny look. "Miles, miss? I'd say it's a quarter mile at most. You can see the highway right from here." At this point, I couldn't help it. I had to know. "What happens if I drive?" And I gave him the directions the man in the store had given me. Texas looked at me very intently and asked me how I knew about that route. It was pretty far out, and usually only locals knew about it, so I told him. He was quiet for a few minutes, and then asked what the attendant looked like, and if I had a map of the state. Nope, just my MapQuest, which wasn't helpful in this situation. He goes to his truck and grabs a raggedy local map from his glove box. Spreading it out for me, he traces the route I described. The way the man from the gas station had told me to go led away from town, away from the interstate, and led to, seemingly, the middle of nowhere. Texas told me that the road did go about 17 miles, right before it dead-ended in the desert. I asked him what was out there, and he told me that it was nothing but some junked cars and a few trailers and mobile homes, all owned by the same family. This family was known locally as troublemakers, meth heads, and alcoholics, and these were the nice things townspeople had to say about them. and the erstwhile clerk was part of this family and lived down that road. I'll never forget the look in Texas's eyes as he told me this. He also told me that I was smart to listen to my instincts, and he told me to be careful traveling out there. I don't know if the man from the gas station wanted what was in the back of my U-Haul, or what was in the driver's seat, but thankfully, I didn't have to find out. Oh, and I learned that sometimes angels look like ruddy-haired Texans with scruffy faces and rusty pickups. Thank you, random Texan stranger. You really saved my ass, and I will always remember you with tons of love. Sorry I didn't ask your name. You're forever Texas to me now. My family and I were driving from Ohio to Wyoming one holiday season to visit family about 10 years ago. Due to storms farther north, we traveled straight west instead of northwest at first, and split the trip at Omaha, staying the night before heading up through Nebraska into South Dakota. Once we were far enough north, we turned west onto I-90. At that point, it had been over an hour since we saw anywhere that might have a public restroom, and we were on state routes, so no rest areas. Those of you who have traveled with a young kid know that's close to their bladder and boredom's limit, and our daughter was begging to stop somewhere to pee. South Dakota was similarly deserted, and even worse as we headed west. Finally, we reached a desperately needed rest stop, as my, at the time, 5-year-old and I both needed to pee by then. Just as we pulled in, the truck that had been following us for a while pulled in too. I didn't think too much of that at first, until I started to open my door. My head was turned to the right, where the truck was parked a couple of spots over. My eyes met the driver's, and I just shivered. He was a skinny white guy, straggly grey-brown beard and dark eyes. I could see that he was wearing a dingy, dirty blue plaid shirt. He got out of his 90s brown and cream truck and started rummaging in the bed. I told my husband I didn't want to go into the rest stop alone because of the guy and the weird feeling I got from him. He thought I was being a little silly but agreed to come with us. At that point, the next stop was Wall, South Dakota, about 100 miles away according to the huge billboards we'd passed advertising it. He figured he'd better empty his bladder, even though he didn't particularly feel a need. I grabbed my daughter, and we headed inside, followed by the guy who'd finished rummaging at his truck but wasn't carrying anything when I glanced back. My daughter and I did our business in the women's restroom and headed back out to the lobby. As I expected, my husband was already out there, since he didn't have a small human to chaperone. The old guy was also in the tiny lobby area. He was just standing there staring at my husband. My husband rushed us back to our car. As we were buckling in, he locked the doors. Then he told me that the guy hadn't even gone into the restroom and was just standing in the lobby the whole time. He agreed with me that we might have just had a close call, and he was glad it hadn't just been me and our daughter there. However, that's not the end of the story. Remember how I mentioned Wall and that it was 100 miles away? Well, that was 100 miles of pretty empty landscape, but a decent number of turnoffs from the interstate. We didn't see the truck following us and thought the whole episode was behind us. Except when we stopped in Wall to grab lunch and some road snacks, plus look around this homey but fun little tourist trap in the middle of nowhere. We saw the guy in the store not even 20 feet from us. Same face, beard, dirty plaid shirt. Thankfully, we'd already eaten, so since he was staring at us again, we quickly paid for our snacks and trinkets and got the heck out of there. Thankfully, we didn't see him again. But I was seriously creeped out until we reached our relatives in Wyoming safely, with no other sight of that truck. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa.